All right, very good. Well, thank you, Carrie. And I also wanted to thank Ray and Vicky for helping me get this set up. They've been very helpful in answering any questions I had or just making sure I was up to date with the technology. Vicky helped me learn how to use these fancy headphones that I'm using right now. I had not been using them during telework time the last year. So it's a new improvement for me. I actually like it quite a bit. I wish I started a year ago. So thank you for the introduction. And yeah, it sounds like a lot of you have seen what's been going on up at Bogus Basin. We've had some activity occurring up there, I think starting since 2019. And got this picture a couple of weeks ago, just sitting up at the top of Deer Point. I'm sure if you've been up on the mountain, that's a scene that's very familiar to many of the Boise locals here. You can't see all of the forest from up here because that's the funny thing about ski resorts is they clear a lot of the trees away so you can go down and have fun on your skis or your snowboard. But the trees that are around, hopefully we'll learn a little bit about some of those and some of the insect disease and wildfire issues that are going on there today. So I'm going to move on to my introduction. Carrie gave me an introduction. I didn't know if it would be read in full, and it was, but I just provided that information here for you folks. The one thing I forgot to include at the bottom here is that I am a winter sports enthusiast myself. So I have been up to Bogus Basin several times. I've had a season pass up at Bogus Basin for I'm not sure how many seasons. I did depart a couple of years and go to Tamarack. So I don't know if I should tell the resort that, but I'm back to Bogus now. And then I put the second picture in there so you can see me without my face covered up. I thought that would be a little bit unfair if you couldn't even see me. So I decided to put two pictures in there. I did want to go over just a few kind of housekeeping things before we get started. And I just want to say that I do use a lot of pictures, and I'll probably stop and talk about the pictures a lot. I try to stay away from walls of text. I do have text where it's necessary and just to kind of wrap up a few points, but I try not to bombard you with too much of that. And I like to keep it pretty informal. I do have kind of a discussion, question and answer period slated at the end, but if you have a question in the middle, feel free to ask. I don't know if you guys moderate these with someone raising a hand or how that works exactly, but we do have a discussion period at the end as well, if you can hold your question. And then lastly, if I do use any jargon, I try to make things simplified. I know not everyone's a forester, so if you hear something that you don't quite know if it makes sense, if you can write it down and we can discuss it at the end too. I try not to do that, but sometimes it's hard when we live in these worlds we work in these days, it seems like. And then lastly, I do have a list of references I can provide afterwards. I did not attach them to this PowerPoint, but I do have them if anyone is interested. I can send them out to the group. So if we're ready to go beyond that, I'm going to get started. All right, so I've really identified three main things that I want you guys to take away from this discussion today. And really it's just learning about the disturbance ecology of a lot of these mixed conifer forests of Southwest Idaho. And when I say mixed conifer, at Bogus Basin, it's really low elevation ponderosa pine and Douglas fir. There is some trace aspen in there, but that's not a conifer, and it's a pretty minimal amount of the forested stands in this area. We do, in some places along creeks, have some Engelmann spruce, but that's a little bit higher elevation usually, and with some more present water. And then this is kind of below the subalpine fir lodgepole pine zone, so it's kind of that mid-elevational, low forested area that's kind of warmer and drier, and it doesn't quite have the diversity of species that we have at some of our higher or wetter elevations. So it's pretty dry mixed conifer forest. After we go over some of the disturbance ecology, we're going to talk about the conditions of the forest as they currently are, or I guess as they were a few years ago at least, because we're trying to manipulate and change them currently. But we'll go with the current conditions of the forest around Bogus Basin. And then lastly, I'm going to spend probably the lion's share of this discussion talking about the different aspects of vegetation management, what you maybe have seen already at Bogus Basin, what's going to be coming up in the future. We have a whole succession of events that we move from through vegetation management, and it's in kind of a nice sequential order that we usually go through. We just got started a couple of years ago, so we're kind of at the beginning of it, the first couple of years. So hopefully when you're done, you can at least answer questions on those 3 points about what's going on at Bogus Basin and the disturbance ecology and why we're doing the treatments that we're proposing to do. So disturbance ecology, disturbances are just discrete events in time that disrupt the ecosystem, community, or population structure and change resources, substrate availability, or the physical environment. So that picture that I took down there, that is in the Pioneer wildfire that occurred between Idaho City and Loman. This area is just past Moores Creek Summit. On the east side, obviously the west side did not burn, but this was a mid-elevation ponderosa pine forest that just pretty much burned entirely. These were small to medium-sized trees. They weren't overly mature in this area, but they were dense, and the fire took full advantage of that situation. So you can see the ground, there's really no shrub or brush cover down there. It was just a crown fire in this area with a few needles still on the trees, but I'm sure they're scorched and the trees didn't make it. So there was a lot of acres that that occurred on in 2016. That was a 190,000 acre fire. And so that's a lot of times when people think about disturbances, that's one of the big disturbances that they think about is fire. So that's why I put it up here. First and foremost, in southern Idaho, fire is our most obvious disturbance that we have. But other disturbances that we have that people don't always think about, we have insects and disease. And this talk is going to focus mostly on that and fire. So we have a lot of bark beetles and dwarf mistletoes, and we'll get into those here in a little bit. Disturbances that happen in other forests or in smaller scales, even on these forests, include things like wind or avalanche or landslides. Wind is actually a really big disturbance factor in forests in the east, in a lot of hardwood forests, but in the west, wildfire is very dominating. And then avalanches and landslides are usually pretty small scale in comparison. So there's more, but these are kind of the big ones that people often think about when they think about forest disturbances. So we're going to start with the dwarf mistletoe, just because they're kind of all interrelated too. So I just thought I would start with this one because this is a plant that is an obligate parasite. So it needs the conifer species to live. It cannot live on its own. And the interesting thing about the dwarf mistletoes is they are host specific. So there's actually 2 different kinds of dwarf mistletoes on these pictures here. This one directly below the text. This is the Douglas fir dwarf mistletoe. And you can see that it gets to about maybe an inch in length. All the longer it gets a lot of times. So that one is really hard to identify in the woods. A lot of times you're just seeing a lot of the needles of the Douglas fir, and it's really hard to actually pick out the actual stems of dwarf mistletoe. But you can kind of see, and there's these scaly looking things that sort of look like a juniper or a cedar needle, as opposed to the pine or fir needle. And then over here, this is the ponderosa pine dwarf mistletoe. It grows much larger, a lot of times 3 to 8 inches in length, and it's usually a lot more apparent on the tree if you're looking for the plant. The plants are more apparent on the ponderosa pine, but the way that the tree grows and the form of the tree with the Douglas fir is very apparent. You'll see that later on. Regardless if they're host specific or different species, they all are kind of have the same life history. They're dispersed by seed. They get a lot of pressure built up and they kind of spit the seed out during a certain time of year when the temperature and the humidity is right. And they can travel as far as, I think, 60 to 80 feet, but a lot of them land within 15 to 20 feet of the tree. So really they infect neighboring trees of the same species that are in close proximity to the tree that is infected. That's really how they spread, and that's really a key point in managing them for forest health. Interaction with bark beetles. The dwarf mistletoe, as you might imagine, is a parasite. It takes a lot of resources that the tree would otherwise use. and it's just an additional stress onto the tree. So it makes the tree weaker in fending off things like bark beetles. And the bark beetles can tell which trees have less vigorous responses when they get attacked. And then with wildfires, you'll see it later on when you see the form of the trees, but it actually increases a lot of plant growth around the infection site of the dwarf mistletoe. And the plants grow really kind of out of control, especially on the Douglas fir. What that does is it increases what we call canopy bulk density, which is basically just the amount of needles in a cubic meter. And a higher canopy bulk density really just increases surface area for fire to ignite. It's a lot of small diameter fuels that are easily ignitable by fire. And the higher number you have there, it increases your susceptibility to wildfire, especially if it's lower to the ground. And a lot of times these have heavier infections lower in the canopy on the tree. As you would imagine, the infections higher up continually rain down on the lower part of the tree, and the same tree gets reinfected multiple times. So next we're going to move over to talk about bark beetles. And these, again, are very host specific. Sometimes they'll go into 2 or 3 different types of trees, but in these ponderosa pine Douglas fir areas, thankfully, the bark beetles that attack ponderosa pine do not go after Douglas fir and vice versa. They're very host specific to those individual trees. So they actually go after trees who are stressed, and any kind of stress really will do. It can be a drought, it can be physical damage. Competition stress is a big one from overly dense stands. The trees are already fighting for resources amongst themselves. And then again, dwarf mistletoe, and then if the tree didn't die in a fire, if it's scorched, that can cause an additional stress to the tree as well. The Douglas fir beetle typically has 1 generation per year. Some beetles are different. There's a pine engraver beetle that has multiple generations a year. But fortunately, there's about 1 generation per year of the Douglas fir beetle, which is the real problem insect in Bogus Basin area. There are some western pine beetles that attack the ponderosa pine, but those are kind of at a little more of an endemic level as opposed to the epidemic levels that we're seeing for the Douglas fir bark beetle, excuse me. All right, and the last big one is really wildfire. So I'm sure, like I said, this is the big flashy disturbance that everyone hears about around the West in July and August. Bogus Basin has not burned in a large fire for quite a long time. I did a kind of a stand assessment for one of the stands near there, and from what I could tell, going through the dendrochronology, which is you core a tree sample and you can see how many fire scars are indicated on the different levels of bark within the tree. I haven't seen a lot of big fire activity in the area for roughly 110 to 130 years. And that really correlates to a lot of the overstory trees' age as well. So I can kind of assume that a lot of those trees are in that age range, 100 to 130, 140 years old, give or take a few years. That being said, about 80% of this area in and around Bogus Basin is in what we call the non-lethal fire regime. And what that means is that when a fire occurs there, historically, it was non-lethal and it didn't kill the majority of the trees. So those couple of metrics underneath there, fires would occur every 5 to 25 years, and usually less than about 10% mortality. So what that means is we'd have a lot of ground fires, and these trees have really thick bark. So it might clean up a lot of the needles on the ground, and it might kill some of the smaller diameter trees that have needles low to the ground. But these big trees would survive a lot of fire cycles, and that's exactly what these are. These are called cat faces or fire scars, and these are old fires that have burned, and they killed some of the bark, but they didn't kill the tree. So you can kind of see if you have an indicator of those in an area. These are trees roughly the same age, and they've survived a few fires. You get into problems where you miss fire return intervals. So if it's 5 to 25 years and we haven't had a fire for roughly 125 years, we've missed at a minimum 5 fire return intervals, and at a maximum 25. So it can be a big deal as far as fuel accumulation on the ground. And a lot of times without fire in the area, that's why you have a lot of overly dense stands. These stands probably would not have been as dense as they are today under these non-lethal fire regimes. The remainder of this area is under a mixed 1 fire regime, which has a little bit of a longer return interval on the upper end, up to 70 years. So those ones may not be as departed from the historical conditions that we're used to seeing. But again, this is only about 20% of the area around Bogus Basin. The return interval can be as low as 5. So we still could have missed several cycles. And it's really, even when you get a fire there, you do expect to see more mortality because of the buildup of fuel. So you expect to see 10 to 50% mortality in these mixed 1 fire regimes. So these areas in Bogus Basin area are typically focused at the highest elevations, some of the cooler, wetter sites. And then again, over on Boise Peak, if you're looking at the entire Boise Ridge as a whole. So those are really the 2 primary fire regimes that occur on the Bogus Basin, Boise Ridge area. And I think that kind of wraps up our discussion of just the disturbance ecology of a lot of these mixed conifer forests. So current conditions. I really like this picture because this is a view from the Boise Ridge Road looking at, this is Boise Peak right here. And you can see this ridge kind of in the foreground right here. And it looks pretty healthy. There's a lot of green. You don't see a lot of gray on that ridge. It's a little more open, but it's still forested. And it generally looks like a healthy stand. And then if you look at the stands up on the ridge itself, there's a lot of gray pockets in there. And those are the expanding pockets of bark beetle mortality, really focused on areas of heavy dwarf mistletoe infection. Fire has not impacted this area yet. The interesting thing you might ask is, why is this ridge up here in the front so green and healthy, and this ridge in the back looks like it's kind of falling apart? And the reason is the management style. This ridge in the front is private land that is kind of an inholding in the forest. And this is Forest Service land that hasn't seen management since we've acquired the land, from what I can tell, in the 1930s. So that's really the main difference, is this land's been managed for thinning, and I would assume timber production. That's not why we manage the land, but I assume that's why the private landowner did. But you can see it's a lot more green and a lot healthier than that stand in the background there. I just like this picture because it's a good comparison contrast, and it highlights a lot of the issues that I talked about with disturbance ecology and what it does on a larger scale. So again, during current conditions, we're just going to go through kind of those 3 disturbances, and there's one additional factor I'm going to throw in at the end for that. So the dwarf mistletoe, remember I said the Douglas fir is really hard to find on the plant if you're looking really closely, but if you step back a ways, it's really easy to see on the plant. These are the witch's brooms, they call them, that the dwarf mistletoe causes the tree to grow kind of out of control at these locations. These trees are heavily, heavily infected if they're brooming to this extent. And this is at Bogus Basin right here, and this is at the ridge just off of Bogus Basin Road. So this is pretty much the condition of the trees currently, a lot of the Douglas fir trees in the Bogus Basin area. I believe a forest health assessment said there was upwards of about 90% of the Douglas fir in and around Bogus Basin had some level of dwarf mistletoe infection on it, which is extremely high, and it's much higher than what you'd expect to find in a stand that had a fire regime that was not so departed. You can see what I was talking about with the canopy bulk density, these masses of foliage. If a fire gets lit under there, that tree is going to torch out. It's going to take that whole tree out, instead of having either an open canopy below here, or just something that's less dense, that's less flammable. All right, bark beetle mortality. You saw it in that first picture, the big expanding pockets of bark beetle. This is just off of Bogus Basin Road, just below it. And I like this picture because you can see all of the trees aren't dead, but largely the ones that are Douglas fir. And a lot of them, you can see evidence of some brooming branching patterns here on the skeleton of the tree. It looks like we have, this is the Douglas fir back here that's still green. But here you've got a pine, pine, pine. In the foreground, there's a lot of pine that's still green, but the Douglas fir has been fading pretty fast because of the dwarf mistletoe bark beetle combination. And I didn't say it before, but the dwarf mistletoe doesn't kill the tree. It shouldn't kill the tree because it needs the tree to live itself. So it'll keep the tree alive, it'll just weaken it. But a lot of times the bark beetles come in and take the tree out within a season. This is kind of the extra element I'm throwing into the current conditions up at Bogus Basin. It is a extremely developed recreational area in comparison to the rest of our forest. So obviously we have the ski resort is the primary recreation site there, but we have a lot of other recreation infrastructure in and around the area. We have miles and miles of mountain bike and hiking trail. And not shown in this picture, but we also have the Schaefer Butte campground. And a lot of people just go up in the area, even just to enjoy an afternoon away from the heat. So not necessarily any specific recreation, but it's accessible and it's close to a large population center that is just very heavily used, probably one of the heaviest used places on the Boise National Forest. So that's just adding an extra element into the mix here. And this picture is kind of interesting because you can see this little square on this tree. This is, it's called an MCH cap, but it's a chemical pheromone that replicates a pheromone that the bark beetles produce. And the bark beetles produce two kinds of pheromones. One of them says, hey, you guys, come over to this tree. This tree is a great place for a home. And so it's called an aggregation pheromone, and it brings other bark beetles to that tree. And the other one, as you might imagine, is exactly the opposite. It's an anti-aggregation pheromone, and it says, you know, this tree is full, there's no more room in the inn, go somewhere else. So these MCH caps, verbenone is the name of the chemical, they emulate that anti-aggregation pheromone, and we put them on high value trees and they keep the bark beetles away from that tree, or at least more so than they would without them. Sometimes they'll still get into a tree, but this definitely helps. So that's one of the treatments we've done there in the past, but it gets expensive to do that every year, and it's better. It's kind of a band-aid. It's not treating the problem. It's just kind of a band-aid to the problem. And then lastly, the wildfire susceptibility. This was taken near Aldape Summit, so just on the southern end of the Boise Ridge there. And this is looking to the east, and I believe this was during the 2016 Pioneer wildfire. So I just like it because it shows the smoke in the background there. You're still in the green part of the forest, but on the mountain home in Idaho City District, we've had a pretty large and recent fire history in the last 10 years. We had a 130,000 acre fire in 2012, two fires in 2013. One was 150,000, one was 130,000, and then a 190,000 acre fire in 2016 with the Pioneer Fire. So, you know, we've burned upwards of 600,000 acres in the last 10 years on the southern half of the Boise National Forest. This area around Bogus Basin is one of the last green areas on the Mountain Home District that has not burned recently, but it's got conditions to burn if it were to start. All right, now we're getting to all of the vegetation management activities that are going on. This was a map I developed for another discussion that I did to one of our stakeholder groups. They wanted some updates on what we've been doing. And these are just the different commercial timber sales that we've awarded as of, I think it was earlier this year, 2021. But it shows kind of the progression around the mountain. So the orange here is what was awarded in 2019. It was really just this area right past the Nordic Lodge, which is kind of right here on the private land. And then in 2020, we awarded a pretty big chunk, a lot of the mountain. They have completed most of it. They're still working on a couple pieces, but that was what they were working on in the field season of 2020, all around the mountain there. 2021, we just awarded this kind of light blue color stuff here. And if I get the colors wrong, I am colorblind, so I try my best. But we just awarded this stuff earlier this year, and they'll probably be working in this area this summer and then finishing up some of the red. This to be awarded area, it's a really tricky piece of land. We may not actually get to it. It's just kind of a technical piece of ground to go and treat with commercial equipment. So we may have to look at other means of treating that. And then this stuff over on the west side, this is going to be in a larger project that includes some stands kind of outside of Bogus Basin, but kind of down here to the south primarily. There's a fair bit of treatment going to be going on in that same project that will hopefully be awarded later in 2021, probably not start operations until 2022. So that's just kind of the area, kind of the progression so far. And I'm going to go through a lot of these different treatments here in our next phase of this discussion. So this is where it could get a little wordy with jargon. I'm going to try to explain things without getting too technical, but please let me know if I need to explain something a little bit better. So commercial harvest, this is what everyone sees initially, the big decks of logs on the landings, heavy equipment moving big trees around. But really we have 3 different types of treatments that we're doing out there. And I just want to go through what the intent and the purpose of each of these 3 treatments are. So we have intermediate treatments, which that is just kind of a technical term that means we do not intend to regenerate this stand because we're not removing enough trees to totally denude the landscape. So it's not a clear cut. They're just thinnings. They're intermediate treatments to kind of let the residual trees grow in a more free state and free of competition. And we also can remove some of the diseased and damaged trees in the process. So we have 2 main types of intermediate treatments we're doing. We have a commercial thin, which these are targeted to retain the biggest trees, and they'll reduce competition for the remaining trees. And what this does is it increases the diameter growth of the remaining trees. So we want big trees on the forest, and this is one way to make the residual trees grow bigger at a faster rate. Both of these intermediate treatments do that. The big difference and the big distinction between the commercial thin and the improvement thin is the improvement thin really strives to shift the species composition more in the favor of one species or another. And in this case, a lot of our insect and disease issues are in the Douglas fir. So we're really trying to shift and favor retention of ponderosa pine up at Bogus Basin. But again, it reduces competition and it increases diameter growth of the remaining trees. A lot of times we do these as thinnings from below, meaning we'll remove the smallest trees. Something else that does is it removes what's called ladder fuels, which are smaller trees that can carry fire from the ground to the crown, or act as a ladder to make fires more damaging to the overstory. So if we can raise our canopies, we have less likelihood of fire getting up into the crowns. And if the fire is on the ground, these trees are both very thick barked, and they can survive pretty decent ground fires after they reach a certain age. And that's why you see those trees with a lot of fire scars that aren't dead. They survive those fires and those events. If we can change this to a ground fire situation, that changes dramatically the future fire regime on this landscape. And then lastly, regeneration treatments. The distinction here is this was designed because we wanted to reforest or regenerate the stand. So these are kind of in our heaviest hit areas with dwarf mistletoe or bark beetles. It's really a lot of times a hazard tree removal, particularly on the slopes if there's a lot of dead trees around the ski runs. And it's removing the dead and dying trees that are in the vicinity of that infrastructure for recreation. We do retain the healthiest trees if we can. We have to retain a certain amount of trees for forested cover. But the intent in these regeneration treatments is to go back in and reforest. And already know or already assume, but we would reforest with ponderosa pine. Since everything's host specific, the ponderosa pine is really the best tree to put on this ground to kind of break that disease cycle with dwarf mistletoe and to reduce the impacts of the bark beetles. I didn't make a whole section for hazard tree felling because it's really a component of multiple of these commercial and non-commercial treatments. All right, so the non-commercial thinning, this sometimes is a standalone treatment, or it would occur after the commercial treatment. So that's kind of the progression of events. We usually do the commercial harvest first and then move into non-commercial. If there is no opportunity for commercial, we just start with non-commercial. And usually that's in smaller diameter, younger stands. But it's the same concept. We remove small diameter trees growing underneath the larger trees. It reduces competition. It reduces the ladder fuels. And again, we like to favor the ponderosa pine over the Douglas fir. This reduces the incidence of dwarf mistletoe, and it also kind of sets back our successional time frame. Ponderosa pine is a little bit more of an early successional as opposed to Douglas fir. They both can be early successional, but ponderosa pine is probably a little bit more so. This just shows, I like this picture because it shows a good example of those ladder fuels that I was talking about. You can see these trees here growing right underneath this bigger tree. If a fire kind of runs through here, it's just going to torch this small Douglas fir, and that's going to be just a conduit for fire to get into this overstory up here. So if we can remove those smaller trees and leave the bigger ones, we can really increase the chance of survival of those overstory trees if and when a fire does occur in the area. All right, fuels reduction activities. We have a whole suite of activities that we can pick from, and that really a lot of times is determined by our fire managers after we go in and do our commercial and non-commercial treatments. So during our commercial and non-commercial, we have either landing piles, that is just the slash piles that we put at the landings, or if it's a non-commercial treatment, we'll build piles out in the woods of just the non-commercial thinning slash. After the piles are built, they're usually allowed to cure for a year. So they're nice and dry, and then they go out and they burn the piles. They do have broadcast burning as an opportunity. That's kind of a large scale burn. We probably won't use that a lot in this Bogus Basin area, but I just wanted to talk about it because in some places it is used more. There's a lot of mixed ownership here and steeper slopes, and sometimes the broadcast burning isn't as easy to manage in those types of conditions. And then something we analyzed for also is mastication, which this device down here is a masticator. It's basically a big chipper, and it'll go to those piles or large concentrations of fuel, and it'll just put them through the chipper and spit it back out on the site. I really like this point because it's really key to a few things. It reduces the fuels, or it makes them smaller and they degrade easier, but it really helps us for the next step, which is the site preparation. So in those areas that we do want to reforest, some of the challenges that we have when we open the stands up like this, a lot of times a very heavy brush response. So we'll have the cherry and the willow and the nine bark and the ceanothus really come in quite heavily, quite quickly after we open up some of these areas. What the mastication can do is it really can put that fuel layer down on the ground and suppress some of that brush response, which allows us to go in and plant and get conifers reestablished on the site. It's really hard to get conifers in there if we have a lot of brush that's really out competing for that growing space. So we can use burning for site prep. Both of these can be used for site prep. Mastication in a lot of instances is a better alternative just because you can do it. It's easier to sequence your events. You can plan for when you want to reforest, whereas with burning, you have to make sure you meet certain wind and weather conditions so you can burn a certain year, and sometimes you might miss those. So you can get in a situation where you have seedlings in the nursery that you want to plant next year, but you can't plant them because you weren't able to get your site prep done. So the burning is just a little more unpredictable, but it can be effective on steeper slopes where the masticators can't go, and it is more cost effective than the masticators. Masticators are good on gentle to moderate slopes. Like I said, easier to time and sequence your events. It really handles the brush a lot better than fire does. And then it's also smokeless. A big thing we have to consider when we're burning is creating smoke in the valley. When we burn up at Bogus Basin, it gets funneled right down into Boise. And that really limits the extent to what we can burn and when we can burn up in those areas close to town. All right, and then after our site prep, usually the next year, that's when we wanted to get our little seedlings in the ground. So in this area, we are probably only exclusively going to plant ponderosa pine. It doesn't make sense to plant Douglas fir, especially if we have some overstory trees that still have dwarf mistletoe in them, because they would just be ripe for infection when those spores fall on them if they're anywhere near an infected tree. But we don't have that problem with ponderosa pine. So unfortunately, it's also our preferred species in these low elevation forested types. We plant at variable densities. So as you would expect, usually higher densities on the north and the east slopes, the cooler, wetter slopes, lower densities on the south and the west slopes. And we do that to kind of emulate what would naturally occur. It's usually about 50 to 75 trees per acre difference on each slope for what we plant. And we never have 100% survival. So sometimes nature takes care of the density for us as well. So we usually plant a little bit more than we want, and we do expect some mortality. We do try to take advantage of what we call microsites or nurse logs, and this picture is a really good example of that. This is in a fire. That's where we've done most of our planting lately. But this is a nurse log, and we plant the seedling right up next to it. What that does is it really stops water from flowing, and water seeps into the soil around here more. And it also provides shade if there's a really hot summer or even just hot couple of days. We try to plant on the north side of these nurse logs if we can. These areas in the fire, we don't really have to do a lot of site prep because they've been burned pretty extensively with the fire. This is just the area that we cleared around. This is called a scalp. And that's what the planters do. They scalp about 2 feet by 2 feet around the seedlings. And that's essentially our site prep to remove that competing vegetation until that plant can take hold and get above the competing veg. So we're going to be doing it a little bit differently at Bogus. We're not going to be doing it in a burned landscape. So we might have a little more intensive site preparation needed than we would after a fire. The next step I just have is some monitoring, and we kind of monitor throughout the entire process, whether it's the commercial or non-commercial contract, site prep or reforestation contract. We always have people out there working with the contractors. It's a little bit unique at Bogus Basin because we're working with the Idaho Department of Land. They've been managing some of the contract administration on those commercial sales. But once we move into the site prep and reforestation, I know we would be doing the reforestation. The site prep, we're still debating if the state wants to do that or if we want to take that with the Forest Service. But there will be some level of contract administration ongoing throughout, and that's just making sure they don't do resource damage or they stick to the specs, those type of things. We always do site prep or regen assessments before we plant, so we find out where we need to put the trees. If we have natural regeneration coming in and it is of the species and density that we like, we don't plant those areas. But we just need to do those assessments the year before so we know how many to plant. And then we have first, third, and fifth year survival and stocking surveys. So survival surveys is how many seedlings survived, and the stocking is how dense is our new stand. If they make it through the fifth year, we actually just certify it as a new established stand, and it goes into our forested veg database as a stand established in 2025 or whatever year it was that we planted it. And we track that stand through its life cycle, through all of its management that we do in that piece of ground. And then mitigations. As with most of our projects, we have a whole litany of mitigation measures that we do for plants and critters and people and bugs. I just picked kind of a few of the big ones in this area to talk about. But Sacagawea is bitterroot. I'm sure if you guys are a botany group, you're familiar with this plant. We have a few of these at the really high elevations in Bogus, and we designate what we call PCAs or plant conservation areas. Usually that's a set of 3 concentric rings. There's one that goes out 100 meters from a known population, one that goes out 300 meters, and one that goes out 500 meters. And in those zones, you can do different things. In the first zone, you can't do anything. There's no treatment allowed. In the second zone, you can do non-commercial treatments only. So have hand crews go in there and fell some of the small diameter trees, but you can't have heavy equipment go in there. And then in the outer ring, you can have heavy equipment operating, but you have to do dust abatement so you don't impact the pollinators or any of the actual plants that are in that area. So we have those type of conservation measures for bitterroot, and we have similar things for goshawk. We have a protection buffer right immediately around the nests where we can't do anything. And then we have what's called the post-fledgling area, which is a larger area around the nest that we can do some sort of limited management. It's usually, we have to retain higher densities because goshawks like more dense stands. So it's a little hard to manage for higher densities and to meet some of our forest health objectives, but it's a compromise. We're not all about one thing or the other. So we have goshawks in certain parts of areas around Bogus Basin that we will have higher densities that we just can't go and do the same treatment everywhere. The other ones are not really for protecting things like the pine engraver beetle. That's actually another beetle that gives us problems. It's got an interesting life cycle where it's got multiple generations a year and it attacks small diameter trees or thinning slash. So we have to have timing restrictions on when thinning can occur. And then if we do have thinning occurring outside of that time frame, we have to do what's called a green chain, which is provide recently cut material in an area to kind of draw the insects into that area so they don't get into epidemic levels and kind of go into the neighboring stand. So you can operate in those time frames. You just have to do other things to kind of control the population of those insects. And then recreation, we try to get out press releases. We're having targeted trail closures in some areas. When we get to the larger area around Bogus Basin, we've identified a few loops that will be closed at one time, but the whole system won't be closed at the same time. So there will still be opportunities for people. And it's really just managing the trail system as a whole and giving people opportunities while we can still get some work done in areas at different times during the operations. So we do take a lot of those things into consideration. Timeline, I've kind of talked about a lot of this as I've gone through, but these are just rough time frames because we have several different sales or projects going on at once. So it's hard to give you just a single year, but roughly our commercial harvesting started in 2019 and will be finishing up in 2023, maybe some in 2024. Non-commercial thin, like I said, typically follows the commercial thinning. And then again, fuel reduction and or site prep would occur after the non-commercial thinning, reforestation after that, and the monitoring and mitigations is going on throughout all of it. So this is kind of a rough timeline. In the Bogus Basin area, I would hope we could have most of our reforestation done by 2024, 2025. But again, we have, that's specific to Bogus Basin. There's areas outside of that that aren't too far away that could have activities going on into the late 2020s. So just a quick review. We talked about dwarf mistletoe, bark beetles, wildfire, and their interactions. We talked about the existing conditions of overstocked late cereal successional stands that already have infections of dwarf mistletoe and epidemic levels of bark beetles, at least in the Douglas fir. And then we talked about a whole bunch of vegetation management activities. I just summarized them into thinning or removals, fuel reduction, and reforestation, but there was a whole host of them before. So that's really, hopefully you guys can at least look at what's going on in the mountain up there and have a better idea of what we're doing and why. And if people ask you about it, I would hope you can give them a little more informed answer about what we're doing and the intent of our activities. So that's all I have for you guys. I appreciate the time this evening, but I do want to open it up if there's any questions or discussions or anything you have for me.